They said, "Mrs. Davis, why did you cancel your life-saving medication coverage?" That was the first sentence my doctor spoke when I picked up the phone, and it fell into me like cold water. I remember standing by the kitchen sink, still holding the dish rag, the smell of lemon soap heavy in the air, and thinking he must have called the wrong number. Cancel my coverage? I hadn't canceled anything. I hadn't even changed pharmacies. I'm 76 years old, careful to a fault, the kind of woman who keeps receipts in labeled envelopes and still writes grocery lists on the back of old calendars. I told him there had to be some mistake. He sighed gently, that practiced doctor's sigh that lives somewhere between pity and impatience, and said, "You signed a transfer of benefits form last month. Everything moved to a new private policy." My knees began to buzz, not from fear, but from recognition, because suddenly I could see my son Evan at my dining table, smiling that half-tired, half-hurried smile he wears when he's about to tell me what's best for me. I can still see the sunlight that afternoon, the way it slipped through the blinds in thin lines, striping the paperwork he laid before me. "It's just an update," he'd said. "Medicare's changing some requirements, and this will keep you covered without the headaches. You know how confusing the system is." I did know. I've spent half my life translating bureaucratic nonsense, first for my late husband, when the factory cut his benefits, later for Evan himself, when he couldn't figure out his student loans. I trusted him. I always have. So when he handed me the pen, blue ink, capped neatly, ready, I signed where he pointed. I even thanked him for handling what I called the adult things. That's the cruelty of trust, isn't it? You don't feel the cut until later, when you try to stand and realize you've been bleeding for a while. After the doctor's call, I hung up and stared at the paperwork scattered on the counter, though I didn't really see it. Outside, the mail truck rolled past, the neighbor's dog barked at nothing, and the world went on perfectly unaware that mine had just tilted. I poured myself a glass of water, and it trembled in my hand. When you reach my age, you start fearing strokes, aneurysms, the quiet betrayals of your own body, but not this, not betrayal from the living, breathing child you raised. I sat down and tried to replay the moment he'd come over with the folder. He'd said it so casually. "Sign here to update your insurance," as if he were asking me to initial a birthday card. I remember the color of the folder, sky blue, with a white sticker that read, "Client copy." I remember him glancing at his phone between explanations, distracted, irritated at some work email, and me wanting not to be a burden, wanting to make things easy. That's the part that stings the most now, how easy I made it. That evening, I pulled out my old metal lockbox from the closet, the one with a squeaky hinge and a faint smell of dust and pennies. Inside were the usual relics, Derek's pension letters, my marriage certificate, the faded photo of Evan at his college graduation, smiling with his arm around me like we were still a team. I took out my insurance file and laid it next to the new papers Evan had left. The difference was immediate even before I put on my glasses. My signature, yes, but in a place that didn't belong to me, under a heading I didn't understand. Transfer of primary benefits to designated dependent. Dependent. That word hit me like a slap. Who was dependent on whom? I traced the letters slowly, the way you touch a scar that's still tender. The next morning, I called Evan. He didn't pick up. I left a message, calm and polite. "Sweetheart, I think there's been a mix-up with the insurance. Call me when you can." He called back 3 hours later, cheerful, distracted. "Oh yeah, Mom, I meant to explain that. The new plan consolidates everything. You're still covered, but it's more efficient. Less paperwork for both of us." Both of us. It sounded so neat, so managerial. I asked about my prescriptions. He said they'd be fine, as long as you don't overuse them. I'd never overused anything in my life. Not pills, not patience, not even kindness. When I mentioned the doctor's call, he laughed softly. These clinics always panic when something changes. Don't worry, you'll see, it's simpler now. He always says that, as though simplicity were the same as safety. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay awake listening to the refrigerator hum and the wind rattle the loose vent in the hallway. At 2 a.m., I went to the kitchen and read every word of the new policy by the light over the stove. The legal language stretched like a maze. Assumption of fiscal responsibility, co-beneficiary management, optional cost sharing. I read until the letters blurred, and I saw not words, but shapes, the jagged outlines of trust twisting into debt. Somewhere between pages 3 and 4, I realized my son hadn't just updated my plan. He'd replaced it with a private policy under his household account. My coverage now existed only as a sub-benefit of his. If he missed a payment, if he altered a clause, if he decided I cost too much, everything vanished, and my signature had made it legal. In the morning, I tried to convince myself it couldn't be intentional. Maybe he misunderstood. Maybe the agent misled him. I even brewed his favorite coffee blend, hazelnut roast, and waited for the smell to soften my anger. But when I called again, his tone changed, cooler, clipped. Mom, I told you it's done. Don't stress yourself. The old plan was a rip-off anyway. Rip-off. The plan that covered the medication, keeping my heart from fluttering itself into chaos. He sounded like a salesman explaining a return policy. I wanted to shout, but age teaches you that shouting rarely brings truth, only exhaustion. So I hung up, sat at the table, and felt the first true chill of fear settle in my chest. Later that week, the pharmacy refused to fill my prescription. Your coverage is inactive, ma'am, the pharmacist said kindly, eyes lowered. You can pay out of pocket. The amount on the screen might as well have been the moon. I smiled, thanked her, and walked home through the cold wind. On the way, I passed a group of teenagers skateboarding, their laughter bright and careless. I wondered if Evan had ever laughed like that lately. When did he become a man who measured affection in deductions? I reached my porch, sat on the step, and let the grocery bag slide from my hand. A can of soup rolled onto the concrete and dented with a hollow sound. That's how it felt, hollow, small, final. For 2 days, I lived on half doses. The dizziness came first, then the breathlessness. I didn't tell anyone, not out of pride, but because I needed to understand what was happening before I asked for help. I went through the papers again, reading the fine print until my eyes ached. There it was in black and white. Primary payment recipient, Evan Davis. My benefits, my lifetime of premiums, my careful savings, all redirected. And next to my signature, his handwriting filled the witness line. I hadn't noticed that before. My son had witnessed my own undoing. I kept thinking about that folder, the blue one with the cheerful sticker. I'd placed it neatly on the bookshelf after signing, proud of myself for being responsible. He'd even kissed my forehead before leaving, said, "See, Mom, you're all set." And I'd smiled, warmed by his efficiency, by the illusion of being cared for. Now every memory of that day feels like watching a play I used to love, but can no longer stomach. The same lines, the same gestures, but the meaning twisted. That was 3 weeks ago. I've since reinstated part of my coverage through emergency channels, though it took hours on hold and more humiliation than I care to recount. The doctor says my vitals are stable, but my trust isn't. Every time the phone rings, I flinch. Every time I see Evan's name on the caller ID, I feel a strange mix of love and dread. Love because he's my son. Dread because he knows it. And somewhere deep down, beneath the ache and the anger, there's a quiet voice whispering that maybe he didn't mean harm. Maybe he just didn't think I'd notice. But I did notice. I noticed everything. So when people ask who I am now, I tell them simply, I'm Mrs. Davis, 76, widow, still alive because I learned too late that signatures can be as dangerous as secrets. And I live alone now, not by tragedy, but by choice. Because once you've signed away your safety in ink, you start to understand the value of every breath that still belongs to you. The day everything truly began to unravel wasn't when my doctor called or when the pharmacy turned me away. It was when I decided to visit Evan in person, still believing this could be a misunderstanding. It was a Wednesday morning, the kind of gray Ohio morning when the sky looks like it has forgotten the color blue. I wore my beige coat and sensible shoes, the ones he always teased me about, and I carried the folder of insurance papers in my old leather handbag. The air smelled faintly of rain and car exhaust as I walked to the bus stop, each step steadier than I expected, as if my body already knew this wasn't a visit of complaint, but of confrontation. His neighborhood was one of those new developments with manicured lawns and driveways so clean they looked ironed. When I rang the bell, I half hoped he wouldn't be home, that I could just slip the folder through the mail slot with a note saying, "Please fix this." But he opened the door himself, in a pressed shirt, the smell of coffee and printer ink behind him. "Mom," he said, surprised, not delighted. That tone cut deeper than anything else could. He asked why I hadn't called first, and I told him the phone doesn't always tell the truth. He laughed awkwardly, ushered me inside, and offered tea that he didn't intend to make. The house was immaculate, quiet, full of muted colors and expensive furniture, but it had the hollow air of a place arranged for show, not living. A faint lullaby drifted from upstairs. His wife must have been with the baby. I sat on the couch, straight-backed, the folder clutched in both hands. "Evan," I said, "I need you to explain something to me." He sighed immediately, like a man preparing for a long story he doesn't want to hear. "Mom, if this is about the insurance again, please don't worry. Everything is under control." I placed the folder on the coffee table, the edges trembling. "Then why," I asked slowly, "did my doctor tell me I have no coverage for medication?" He frowned, not with guilt, but with irritation. "You must have gone to the wrong pharmacy, or they haven't updated the system. These things take time." I told him I'd already checked with the insurance company. They said my account had been merged into a private family plan under his name. He looked away, picked up a coaster, and turned it between his fingers. "That's right," he said at last. "It's more efficient this way. The premiums were killing us, and this plan covers the whole family. You, me, and the kids. One payment, one policy. Simpler." He smiled as if simplicity were a gift I should thank him for. I asked, "But my prescriptions, why were they removed?" His voice tightened. "Because, Mom, those drugs cost a fortune. Half your coverage was eaten up by them. This plan gives us flexibility. I'll cover the basics, and we'll handle the rest as it comes." I looked at him, really looked, and saw a man who had learned to speak the language of efficiency so fluently that compassion no longer had a translation. "Handle the rest?" I repeated, my voice shaking just enough for him to hear it. "Do you mean pay out of pocket, or just stop taking them?" He rolled his eyes, the way he used to when I reminded him to wear a coat in winter. "Don't be dramatic. We'll figure it out." The word we hung in the air like a ghost. There was no we. There hadn't been for years. There was only him, his family, his mortgage, his endless chase for a life that looked right on paper. I stood up, suddenly aware that my knees didn't ache as much as usual. "You had no right to sign away my care," I said quietly. "It's my policy, my life." Evan put down the coaster and rubbed his forehead. "Mom, listen. You're not being rational. You said yourself you wanted help with the paperwork. I helped. You signed. It's done. You should be thanking me. Do you even know how much I've saved you?" I wanted to tell him that saving isn't the same as protecting, that sometimes what people call help is just control dressed in polite language. But the words wouldn't come. He kept talking, his voice faster now, filling the room with numbers, comparisons, interest rates, and phrases like out-of-network costs. It was like listening to a foreign language, one where love was measured in fiscal efficiency. At one point, he even smiled, and said, "You'll barely notice a difference." I did notice. I noticed that he didn't once look me in the eyes after that. His wife, Hannah, came down the stairs holding their baby, a little girl wrapped in a pink blanket. She stopped when she saw me, her face a practiced softness. "Oh, hi, Mrs. Davis," she said, adjusting the baby on her hip. Not Mom, never Mom, just a polite distance wrapped in syllables. I smiled back out of habit. Evan said something to her about lunch, and she nodded, pretending not to notice the tension in the room. I realized then that whatever conversation I thought I was having wasn't really between a mother and son. It was between a problem and the person who wanted to solve it efficiently. When I finally left, the air outside felt sharper, colder. The bus stop was 2 blocks away, and I walked slowly, gripping the folder like it could steady me. Every step away from that house felt like walking out of an illusion, one I'd lived in too long. At the bus stop, a young woman was talking loudly on her phone about refinancing her student loans. The words blurred into a strange echo of my own son's logic. Everything in this world seemed to come down to balance sheets and signatures. I wanted to tell her to be careful, that someday someone she loves might hand her a pen and ask for her trust, and she'll give it without blinking. But I stayed quiet. The bus came, I climbed aboard, and sat by the window. That night, I spread all the documents on my kitchen table. I highlighted lines, made notes, circled terms I didn't understand. Dependent, shared liability, reclassification of beneficiary. The phrases danced before me, alien yet intimate, like the handwriting of a stranger who'd once lived in my body. Around midnight, I found a small section I hadn't seen before, a clause stating that the secondary policyholder relinquishes autonomous rights to premium modifications. In plain language, it meant I couldn't change or cancel anything without Evan's approval. My own son had built a legal wall around me. I sat there in the dim light, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence, and thought about the last time I'd been that powerless. It was years ago, when Derek was dying, and every decision came too late. But this time the thief wasn't illness or fate, it was convenience. The next morning, I went to the insurance office downtown, a squat beige building with tired carpet and kind-eyed clerks. I handed the woman at the counter my papers. She adjusted her glasses, scanned the forms, and looked at me with the kind of hesitation people reserve for bad news. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Davis," she said softly. "This policy is managed under your son's household. Without his consent, we can't make any changes." I asked what would happen if I stopped paying. She hesitated again. "Then the policy closes, and any claims under your name would be null." I thanked her, though I didn't mean it, and stepped back into the brittle sunlight. The street outside buzzed with ordinary life, people rushing to lunch, taxis honking, but I felt like I was watching through glass. When I got home, I found a message on my answering machine. Evan's voice, brisk and light. "Mom, please don't go making a fuss at the insurance office. You'll just confuse things. Let me handle it." I replayed it twice, not because I hadn't heard him, but because I wanted to memorize the exact tone, the calm certainty of a man who assumes the person on the other end is too fragile to understand her own life. I sat at the table for a long time after that, staring at the folder. The blue color no longer looked peaceful. It looked like disguise, like something used to lure trust. I realized then that this wasn't an error or oversight. It was a transaction. My son had traded my security for his convenience, and I had signed the receipt. Later that evening, I went to the bathroom to wash my face, and in the mirror, I saw not a helpless old woman, but someone startled by her own reflection. My eyes were sharper than I remembered, my mouth set in a line that felt unfamiliar, almost dangerous. That was the moment the betrayal became real. It wasn't paperwork anymore. It was a truth that lived under my skin. I turned off the faucet, dried my face, and whispered, "You did this to yourself." Not in self-blame, but in acknowledgement. I had let trust become habit. In the following days, small consequences began to appear like cracks in a wall. The pharmacy called again, politely this time, to confirm my medication had been permanently discontinued from coverage. The clinic sent a reminder for a follow-up I couldn't afford. Even the mail seemed complicit, thin envelopes marked "Notice of Change." Each letter felt like a verdict. I paid for my pills in cash, 2 at a time, cutting them in half to stretch the supply. At night, I'd line them up on the counter, tiny white moons, counting backwards from the day I'd have none left. Then came the quietest cruelty. Evan stopped calling for a while. Perhaps he sensed my anger, or perhaps he was simply busy managing the life that had consumed mine. The silence at first was a relief. No explanations, no apologies. But as the days passed, it grew heavy. I started talking to myself in the kitchen, narrating recipes out loud, pretending Derek was still sitting at the table, newspaper open, nodding at the right moments. I remembered how he used to say, "You can tell a lot about a man by how he treats the person who can't help him anymore." I never thought I'd live to see that sentence turn into prophecy. It was during one of those long, silent afternoons that I found the courage to read the fine print again. I traced my signature with a pen, the loop of the D in Davis, the hesitation in the S, and I thought of how certain my hand had been when I wrote it. How proud I'd been to be independent. How eager to prove I could still manage things. Now that same signature sat there, like evidence of my own undoing. I took a deep breath and folded the papers carefully, slid them into a plain brown envelope, and wrote on the front in neat letters, "For review." I didn't know exactly who would review it yet. A lawyer, a counselor, maybe just myself, but I knew it was the beginning of something. The end of silence always starts with one act of paperwork undone. The quiet worsening began not with shouting or argument, but with the kind of silence that spreads through a house like humidity, invisible yet suffocating. After I visited Evan, I told myself that maybe he was right, that I should stop worrying, that perhaps bureaucracy simply needed time to correct itself. I even tried to believe that he meant well, but good intentions do not refill prescriptions. The weeks stretched, one into the other, and each morning became a small rehearsal in pretense, pretending to be fine, pretending not to notice how my body began to slow, pretending that the world still recognized me as a person, rather than a patient whose file had been misfiled. The first true sign that something deeper had shifted came when I went to the clinic for my regular checkup, and the receptionist, a girl with kind eyes and too much eyeliner, said with the careful tone of someone afraid to embarrass me, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Davis, but you're listed as inactive in our system. Do you have a new provider?" Her question was a guillotine wrapped in sugar. I smiled, said I would check, and left before my composure cracked. Outside, the parking lot shimmered with heat, and the smell of asphalt and gasoline clung to the air. I sat in my car, engine off, and tried to think. The steering wheel was hot beneath my palms, but I barely felt it. I thought of Evan's house again, the gleaming counters, the silent wife, the baby wrapped in soft pink, and how every corner of that home radiated comfort purchased at someone else's expense. I realized then that the betrayal wasn't impulsive. It had been planned, calculated with the same precision he used to manage his finances. My son had become an accountant of affection. He measured love in deductions and liabilities, and I was a line item that had grown too costly. The thought was obscene, but once it settled, it refused to leave. In the days that followed, my routine began to collapse around small humiliations. The pharmacy clerk no longer needed to explain why my prescription couldn't be processed. She simply looked at me with weary recognition. The grocery store, where I'd once been greeted by name, now felt like a foreign country because I began to avoid familiar faces, afraid they'd see what I had become, a woman who had lost control over her own survival. The neighbors, kind in the way people are when kindness costs nothing, would wave and say, "How are you doing, Jean?" And I would lift my hand, smile, and lie. The body learns deceit faster than the heart does. I started rationing the pills, cutting them into smaller and smaller halves until they looked like slivers of chalk. The dizziness returned, followed by the strange pressure behind my eyes that my doctor once called the warning whisper. I drank water constantly to trick my body into feeling full, into believing it wasn't starving for the chemical balance those pills had once kept steady. At night, I would wake in the dark, heart hammering, and sit up gasping until the room stopped spinning. Sometimes I'd reach for the phone to call Evan, but then I'd see the image of his face, patient, superior, distant, and I'd put the receiver down. I began to keep a notebook by my bed, writing down the days and symptoms, as if documenting my own decline could somehow make it less humiliating. Then there were the bills, small at first, like pebbles dropped in a pond, then spreading into waves that touched every corner of my life. A correction notice from the insurance company, a reminder of unpaid copay, a notification of coverage adjustment. Each envelope came with its own quiet accusation. I stopped opening them for a while, stacking them neatly in a drawer as though order could disguise defeat. One afternoon, a representative called to clarify a few discrepancies. She spoke in a bright, neutral tone that made me feel both invisible and dangerous. "You're listed as a dependent on the primary account," she explained. "So all authorizations must go through Mr. Evan Davis." I wanted to tell her that I was Mrs. Davis before he was even born, that my name existed long before his, that I had built the life he was now signing away. But instead, I said thank you and hung up. It's strange how quickly dependence becomes a performance. You start acting the way they already see you, soft-spoken, forgetful, hesitant, because it's easier than fighting their assumptions. Evan began calling again, his tone that of a man indulging a fragile relative. "Mom, have you been taking your walks? You sound tired." I told him I was fine. He said, "Good. Don't overthink things. The new plan's saving us both a headache." Us both. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to ask him what headaches he'd ever endured on my behalf. But instead I said, "Thank you, dear," because confrontation is a luxury you can't afford when someone else holds the keys to your survival. One evening, I found a voicemail from Hannah. "Hi, Mrs. Davis," she said, in that clipped, practiced tone that only well-mannered hostility can achieve. "Evan mentioned you were a bit confused about the insurance paperwork. Just wanted to let you know everything's under control. Try not to stress. We've got it handled." The plural we again, that fortress of shared authority. I replayed the message twice and then deleted it, though her voice lingered in my head long after. I wondered if she even realized what she'd said, if she knew that telling someone, "We've got it handled," is another way of saying, "You're not trusted." The first time I realized I might not survive this inaction came one morning when I tried to tend the garden and nearly fainted among the rose bushes. The world tilted, colors dissolving into white noise, and I dropped to my knees, clutching the fence until the dizziness passed. When I finally managed to stand, I looked down at the dirt-streaked hem of my skirt and felt an absurd wave of shame. Not fear, not anger. Shame, as though I had failed to uphold the unspoken contract of appearing fine. That was the day I stopped waiting for Evan to fix anything. I knew then that the only person who could save me had already decided I wasn't worth the cost. Yet the mind, even when cornered, seeks reasons to hope. I began telling myself small lies to survive the days. Maybe the paperwork could be reversed. Maybe the company would realize the error. Maybe Evan hadn't meant harm, only convenience. I even prayed, though my prayers were less like petitions and more like negotiations. If I can just hold on a little longer, if I can find the right words, maybe he'll understand. But understanding is a language people forget once they learn the dialect of self-interest. In late August, I received a letter stamped urgent. Inside, a polite notice informed me that my previous policy had been officially terminated and that any attempt to reactivate it would require the consent of the new policyholder. I sat at the kitchen table, the paper trembling in my hands, and thought of all the other documents I had signed in my life: the marriage certificate, the mortgage, the hospital release forms when Derek passed. Every one of them had carried some mixture of hope and necessity. This one carried only loss. It felt as if a part of my identity had been quietly exiled from itself. I began noticing how people looked at me when I paid with cash for my medications, sympathetic, cautious, as if I were some fragile relic of a past generation unable to navigate modern life. I wanted to tell them I wasn't confused. I was betrayed. But those are not the kind of words you can say to strangers in a pharmacy line. So I just nodded, thanked them for their patience, and went home to count my dwindling supply again. I started skipping meals to afford partial refills. My body, once dependable, became another bill I couldn't pay in full. The quiet erasure extended beyond money and medicine. My social circle shrank, not from malice, but from fatigue. Friends stopped calling because I stopped answering. I couldn't bear to explain again why everything felt heavy. The walls of my house began to hum with silence, a kind of pressure that made me aware of every heartbeat. I cleaned obsessively, floors, counters, windows, as if polishing surfaces could restore control. I began sorting through old boxes, throwing away trinkets that once seemed essential, discovering photographs of Evan as a boy, grinning with a popsicle stain on his shirt. I studied that face, searching for the man who now spoke to me like a client. Somewhere between those two versions of him, something had gone missing, and I didn't know if it was his innocence or my illusion. One night, Unable to sleep, I wrote a letter addressed simply to whoever comes after. I didn't mean death. I meant the next version of myself, the one who might survive this. I wrote, "Trust is not a virtue when given to those who profit from it. It's a leash." I folded the letter and tucked it into my lockbox beside the old pension papers. It wasn't defiance yet, but it was preparation, the faint rustle of rebellion in a house that had forgotten the sound of courage. By early September, my hands had begun to tremble. Pouring coffee became a careful ritual, each movement deliberate to avoid spilling. My reflection in the window startled me sometimes, a stranger's face lined with new weariness. And still, Evan didn't call. That silence became its own kind of message, clearer than any explanation. It told me that in his mind, the matter was settled, the transaction completed. He had, in a sense, purchased peace at the cost of my autonomy. I would like to say that I confronted him then, that I called and demanded justice, but the truth is simpler and sadder. I waited. I waited because that's what mothers do. We wait for our children to remember who they were before the world taught them to prioritize convenience over conscience. I waited until one morning when the light struck the kitchen counter in such a way that it illuminated the blue folder once again, its edges frayed, its cheerful sticker faded. I looked at it and realized that the only thing left to lose was fear itself. The quiet worsening had done its work. It had burned away the last illusions of safety. All that remained was a woman alone with her name, her signature, and the slow dawning knowledge that she was the only one left who could undo what had been done. The shift began the morning I took the bus to the community center on the edge of town. I had seen a notice taped to the pharmacy counter weeks before, a small white flyer with crooked text. Free seminar, Understanding Senior Rights, Health Care, Insurance, and Financial Safety. At first, I passed it without a thought. The word senior always sounded like an apology disguised as a compliment, and I was tired of being described by it. But that morning, after another long night counting pills in silence, I woke with a strange pulse of clarity, the kind that doesn't come from courage, but from exhaustion. I dressed carefully, buttoned my navy coat, and walked to the bus stop. The air had the brittle stillness of early autumn. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The community center was smaller than I imagined. Faded posters of smiling retirees on the walls, the faint smell of disinfectant, and instant coffee in the air. A handful of people were already seated in metal chairs, arranged in a semicircle. Most were women around my age, each wearing that same expression of polite confusion mixed with pride. The kind of face you make when you've been told too many times to trust people who know better. I sat in the back, quietly, hands folded around my purse. A young woman introduced herself as an advocate for elder financial safety. She spoke gently, but her words landed like stones dropped into a still pond. A signature under pressure is not consent. Any change made through misrepresentation can be legally challenged. I felt something inside me stir, a slow ignition, like a flame touching the edge of old paper. I had signed under trust, not pressure, but wasn't that its own kind of coercion? I began taking notes in the small notebook I'd carried for grocery lists, writing down phrases I barely understood. Power of attorney abuse, financial exploitation statute, restoration of benefits through affidavit. Around me, heads nodded. Someone asked about scams, another about bank accounts. I wanted to raise my hand and say, "What about when it's your son?" But the words stayed in my throat. Still, the idea was planted. When the seminar ended, the young woman handed out pamphlets and a list of local legal clinics. I took 2 copies and slipped them into my purse, my fingers trembling not from weakness, but from the thrill of having something tangible to hold on to besides shame. Outside, the day had brightened. The trees along the street were beginning to turn, their leaves curling gold at the edges. I walked slowly, letting the bus pass me by. For the first time in months, I wasn't rushing home to the silence that waited for me. I stopped at a cafe, ordered tea, and opened the pamphlet. There was a section titled, "Steps to Regain Financial Independence." The words were bureaucratic and dry, but beneath them I saw a possibility, a path, faint but visible. That evening, I opened my lockbox again, the one that had become both archive and confession. I took out the blue folder, my old Medicare documents, and the latest letters from the insurance company. I spread them across the table in chronological order, like a detective reconstructing a crime. And it was a crime, even if the law hadn't called it that yet. The deception had been gentle, wrapped in filial affection, but it had stripped me of something sacred, my agency. I found myself studying my own signature again, the loop of the J in Jean, the steady downward stroke of the D in Davis. How strange that something so small, so practiced, could have the power to erase a lifetime of careful independence. I began writing a timeline in my notebook. The day Evan came with the folder, the doctor's call, the first denial at the pharmacy, the visit to his house, the official termination letter. I wrote until the ink bled slightly through the page. Then I drew a box around the last entry and wrote in block letters, "This is where it changes." I didn't yet know what that change would look like, but the act of writing it felt like reclaiming oxygen. For years, I'd believed survival meant endurance. That day, I realized survival could also mean defiance. The following morning, I called the number on the pamphlet for the local elder law clinic. The receptionist had a calm, professional voice that made me want to trust her immediately. "Bring any documentation you have," she said. "We'll review it together." The appointment was in 2 days. I hung up and felt a quiet surge of purpose fill the room. I made coffee, not out of habit, but celebration. The bitterness tasted honest. When Thursday came, I put on my best skirt and blouse, pressed and neat, the way I used to dress for job interviews decades ago. The clinic was in a converted brick house with uneven steps and a peeling sign that read, "Community Legal Aid." Inside, a woman named Marjorie greeted me. She was in her 40s, brisk but kind, the kind of person who looks directly at you when you speak. I handed her the blue folder. As she read, her eyebrows tightened, her pen tapping rhythmically on the desk. "This is common," she said finally, her voice low but steady. "Unfortunately, it happens more often with family than strangers." The word family struck me harder than it should have. She explained that my signature could be contested if there was evidence of misrepresentation. She could help me draft an affidavit, request copies of all correspondence, and petition to reinstate my coverage. Each word sounded like a rope being thrown across a widening gap. When I left the clinic, I felt lighter, not because the problem was solved, but because the silence had been broken. There's a peculiar strength that comes from being seen, even by a stranger. For the first time in months, I walked with my shoulders back. On the bus ride home, I stared out the window at the passing streets, laundromats, pawn shops, diners, and thought of how ordinary everything looked, how easily life disguises the extraordinary moments when people quietly take back what was stolen from them. That evening, I called Evan. My voice was calm, practiced. "I met with a legal advisor today," I said. There was a pause long enough for me to hear his breath catch. "Mom," he said carefully. "What for?" "To understand what I signed," I replied. His tone shifted instantly from irritation to alarm. "You don't need to get outsiders involved. They'll just confuse you." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because I suddenly saw the script he was reading from, the one all manipulators use, the language of protection as control. "I'm not confused," I said quietly. "I'm informed." He muttered something about family privacy, about how this could make things complicated. I let him talk until his words began to collapse under their own weight. When he finally said, "I was only trying to help," I replied, "Then let me help myself." There was a silence so thick it seemed to hum through the line. "Mom," he said finally, softer now, "don't do anything drastic." "I already did," I said. "I asked for help from someone who doesn't benefit from my ignorance." Then I hung up. My hands were shaking, but not from fear, from adrenaline, from the electric pulse of self-respect returning after too long in exile. That night, sleep came easily for the first time in weeks. I dreamed not of paperwork or pharmacies, but of the small garden behind the house. In the dream, the roses had grown wild again, untamed and radiant. When I woke, the morning light filtered through the curtains, soft and gold. The world outside hadn't changed, but I had. In the following days, I gathered every piece of mail, every receipt, every record with my name on it. Marjorie called to confirm that she'd submitted the initial petition for review. There would be forms to sign, statements to write, and waiting, always waiting, but I didn't mind. The act of waiting felt different now. It wasn't helplessness, it was preparation. I began writing again in my notebook, but this time not about symptoms or fears. I wrote reminders. You have proof. You have agency. You are not at his mercy. I taped one of the notes to the refrigerator door where the old grocery list used to be. Somewhere in that quiet reordering of papers and thoughts, I felt the first flicker of forgiveness, not for Evan, not yet, but for myself, for trusting, for hesitating, for needing so badly to believe that family meant safety. It wasn't forgiveness as surrender. It was forgiveness as reclamation. I stopped imagining revenge or confrontation. Instead, I imagined balance, me, standing alone, steady on my own ground. One evening, as I was filing away the last of the documents, I caught my reflection in the window. The woman staring back didn't look defeated anymore. She looked older, yes, and tired, but her eyes had a new clarity. It wasn't youth returning, it was truth. The realization was quiet but absolute. I would never again sign something I didn't fully read, not for love, not for fear, not for peace. That kind of obedience masquerades as grace, but it's just another form of disappearance. When the phone rang later that night and Evan's name appeared on the screen, I let it ring until it stopped. The silence afterward felt not like absence, but like air. I sat at the table, surrounded by papers and the faint scent of brewed tea, and I realized that I was no longer waiting for someone to rescue me. I was already saving myself, line by line, signature by signature, breath by breath. The second wave came quietly, like a tide that pretends to retreat before it swallows the shore. By the time I realized how deep it ran, I was already standing in it. For a few weeks after the meeting at the clinic, I lived inside a fragile calm. The paperwork was in motion, the affidavit drafted, the petition sent. Marjorie had assured me that these things took time, but that we had a strong case. I took her at her word, not because I was naive anymore, but because I needed to believe in someone who earned my trust through competence rather than bloodline. I started sleeping again, a few hours each night, though dreams of ink and signatures still visited me. The days followed a gentle rhythm. Wake, make coffee, tend the small garden, file more documents, wait for the mail. Waiting became an act of faith, not resignation. I thought the worst was behind me. I thought I had already seen the bottom of what betrayal looked like when it wore the face of your own child. I was wrong. It started with a call I didn't expect from the insurance company, not the clinic. The voice on the other end was polite, rehearsed, bureaucratic. Mrs. Davis, we wanted to inform you that your case is under review due to a counterclaim filed by the primary policyholder. For a moment, the words didn't register. Counterclaim? I asked. Yes, ma'am. Mr. Evan Davis has expressed concern that your request for reinstatement was filed under what he described as a misunderstanding, and that the previous policy changes were made with your consent. I thanked her mechanically, hung up, and sat staring at the receiver as though it had burned me. Evan had filed a counterclaim against me, against his own mother. The calm I'd built so carefully cracked open like thin ice. That evening, I walked around the house unable to settle, touching familiar objects as if to confirm they still belonged to me. The photographs on the wall, the dishes I had owned for 30 years, the armchair Derek had favored before his heart gave out, all suddenly looked like evidence of a life someone might try to claim. I kept replaying the word misunderstanding in my head. It was the same word Evan had used when I first questioned him, the same word he used whenever he wanted to sound innocent. It's a perfect word for liars because it implies that everyone else is simply too emotional to grasp the truth. The next day, I called Marjorie. She wasn't surprised. This happens often, she said, voice firm but not unkind. Once the accused party realizes they could face financial scrutiny, they turn defensive. Don't worry, we'll handle it. But the way she said we'll handle it was different from Evan's version. It wasn't a command, it was a promise. She asked me to gather any correspondence or notes I had about the signing. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by fragments of memory. The receipt for the coffee we'd shared that afternoon, the note I'd written on the calendar about his visit, even the voicemail he'd left afterward, saying, "You're all set, Mom." Each piece was small, almost trivial, but together they formed a map of intention. Still, a strange unease followed me everywhere. The phone began to ring more often. Unknown numbers, silent calls that hung up as soon as I answered. Once, I heard breathing before the line went dead. Whether it was coincidence or cruelty, I couldn't say, but the effect was the same. I started flinching at every sound. The mailman began to leave thicker envelopes, forms, notices, copies of statements. One letter, stamped in red, informed me that due to the ongoing investigation, certain payments had been temporarily frozen. The bureaucratic phrasing couldn't hide the implication. My medication coverage was once again at risk. It felt as though Evan had found a way to weaponize time itself, using delay and doubt to exhaust me into surrender. In moments of weakness, I caught myself wondering what he was telling people. Maybe he'd crafted a story, a confused elderly woman misremembering events, an overzealous lawyer taking advantage of her fears. I could hear his voice shaping the narrative, calm, reasoned, sympathetic. He was always good at sounding good. That's the most dangerous kind of liar, the one who believes his own version of events so completely that he can sell it without guilt. One afternoon, as I was sorting through the papers again, I found an old letter from Derek tucked among the tax records. It was written years ago, during a rough patch when we'd nearly lost the house. "Jean," it said, "we have to remember that people only get away with what we let them. Our mistake was always trying to fix things quietly." The words hit me like a message from another life. I realized that in my attempt to handle everything discreetly, I'd been protecting Evan from consequences he'd earned. I folded the letter and placed it beside the affidavit. If this became a war of endurance, I would not be the one who blinked first. The next confrontation came not through paperwork, but flesh. Evan appeared at my door one Saturday morning without calling ahead. The sight of him standing there, a clean shirt, his watch gleaming, the faint scent of cologne, filled me with a disorienting mix of relief and dread. He smiled, that same rehearsed half-smile that never reached his eyes. "Mom," he said lightly, "can we talk?" I let him in. He didn't wait to be invited. The conversation began with civility. He asked how I was feeling, whether the clinic was treating me well. I answered in short, careful sentences. Then he shifted tone, soft but sharp. "You're making this into something it's not. These legal people, they just want to stir things up. You're wasting energy." I told him that the energy was mine to waste. He frowned, the way he used to when I'd correct his homework. "I've been trying to protect you," he said, "from yourself, from scams, from confusion. You've always trusted the wrong people." I looked at him across the table, realizing that the boy who once clung to my hand, crossing the street, now believed I couldn't cross a thought without guidance. "You're right," I said slowly. "I did trust the wrong person, but it wasn't the lawyer." He flinched at that, his jaw tightening. "You don't understand how complicated finances are," he said. "You think everything is about betrayal, but I was thinking long-term. Estate planning, taxes. Do you know how many elderly people go bankrupt because they don't adapt?" I could have told him that adaptation isn't theft, that you can't call control love just because it comes from family, but I was tired of arguing in circles, so I said nothing. He mistook my silence for surrender and leaned closer. "Withdraw the claim," he said softly, almost kindly. "I'll handle the paperwork, restore whatever you think you lost. Let's not drag this through courts and headlines." That last word caught me off guard. "Headlines," I repeated. He hesitated, realizing he'd said too much. "It's just, things like this can get public. You don't want that embarrassment." I stood up then, and for the first time in a long while, he looked small to me. "The only embarrassment here," I said, "is that I raised a man who thinks justice is negotiable." He tried to speak, but I raised my hand. "You should go now." He left without another word, though as he passed me, I caught a flicker of something almost human in his eyes. Fear, maybe, or regret, but it vanished as quickly as it came. After he left, I felt both drained and steady, like a storm that had spent itself. I called Marjorie and told her everything. She listened quietly, then said, "He's escalating because he knows you won't back down. That's good. It means we're close." Close to what? I wasn't sure. Resolution or disaster, but either would be better than limbo. Weeks passed, and then came the letter that changed everything again. It was from the Office of Insurance Oversight, confirming receipt of both claims. Attached was a transcript of Evan's statement. Reading it felt like eavesdropping on a stranger. He had painted me as an elderly parent with mild cognitive impairment, claiming I'd misinterpreted the purpose of the paperwork. He even cited previous memory lapses as justification. My throat closed as I read the words. My own son had declared me incompetent on official record. The cruelty wasn't just in the lie. It was in the precision of it. in how plausible he'd made it sound. I didn't cry that night. I brewed tea, opened my notebook, and began writing every detail I could remember, the dates, the phrases, the way he'd guided my hand to sign. I wrote until my wrist cramped. When I finished, I felt not despair, but clarity. He had underestimated me, just as the world often does with women who've lived long enough to outlast their usefulness. What he didn't know was that endurance teaches strategy. A week later, Marjorie called to say she'd arranged a formal deposition. "We'll present your version directly," she said. "It's time they hear your voice, not just your signature." The thought terrified me, but it also thrilled me. I spent the following nights rehearsing, not lines, but truths. I spoke them aloud to the empty room until the air itself felt like witness. The day of the deposition, I wore the same navy coat I'd worn the day I signed the cursed papers. The symmetry felt right, as if I were reclaiming something physical from that moment. The hearing was held in a small, sterile office with beige walls and a clock that ticked too loudly. Evan wasn't there, only his representative, a lawyer young enough to be his son. He spoke smoothly, confidently, laying out his narrative. Then it was my turn. My voice shook at first, but not from fear, from the weight of all the silence I'd carried. I told them everything, every word, every detail. I even described the blue folder, the sticker that read, "Happy Retirement," the way Evan had smiled when I thanked him. When I finished, the room was still. Afterward, as I stepped outside, the autumn air hit me like a benediction. For the first time in months, I felt my lungs fill completely. I walked to the bus stop, sat on the cold metal bench, and watched the sky shift from gray to rose. Whatever came next, win or lose, would be honest. That was more than I'd had in a long time. But life, I've learned, rarely grants clean victories. The next blow came through whispers, not letters. A neighbor stopped me one morning to say she'd heard I was having trouble managing finances. Someone had called her husband's office asking for references. Evan again, sowing rumors, building a cushion of pity around his reputation. The humiliation was sharp, but it no longer sank deep. You can't shame a woman who's already stood in public wearing the label of dependent and survived. The official decision would take weeks, they said. In that waiting, something unexpected happened. My doctor called again, not with news of coverage, but concern. He offered samples of the medication, said he'd spoken to a representative himself. "You've got people on your side, Jean," he said. The kindness in his voice cracked something open in me, not sadness, but gratitude. It reminded me that goodness still existed, scattered among the noise. When the decision finally arrived, I read it twice to make sure I understood. The board ruled in my favor. My coverage was to be reinstated immediately, and the account reclassified under my sole authority. Evan's access was revoked. The letter used sterile language, but I saw what it meant beneath the ink. I had won, not just the case, but myself. That night, I sat at my table and stared at the documents, the ones that had once been weapons, now turned into proof of survival. Outside, the streetlights flickered, and the world seemed briefly kind again. I poured myself a small glass of wine, cheap, sweet, but mine, and raised it in a silent toast, not to victory, but to endurance, to the long, quiet fight that no one applauds because they never see it. And somewhere, maybe, Evan was reading his own copy of that letter, realizing too late that his mother had not been confused at all, merely underestimated. The moment of reckoning didn't come with fanfare or shouting. It arrived like a stillness so complete it felt sacred. After months of waiting, forms, calls, and the endless bureaucracy that feeds on people's patience, the letter confirming my reinstatement should have been enough. It should have been the end of the story, but it wasn't. There was one final act left, and I could feel it stirring beneath my calm, like a current under ice. When you've been silenced long enough, truth begins to demand a body, a form, an action to inhabit. I thought for a while that the court's decision would speak for me, that justice on paper was enough, but some part of me knew that what I needed was not validation from strangers, but confrontation from the one who had taken my trust and turned it into currency. The law had cleared my name. Now I needed to clear my conscience. It was early evening when I decided. The autumn light was fading, washing the world in that soft, melancholy gold that makes everything appear forgiven. I sat in my armchair for a long while, listening to the clock tick and the faint hum of the refrigerator, thinking about all the times I had waited for Evan to visit, just for the comfort of his voice, his presence, his reassurance that he still needed me in some small way. Now I wanted none of that. What I wanted was acknowledgement, not apology, not reconciliation, just the simple recognition that I had seen him clearly. I picked up the phone and called him. My voice was steady when I said, "Evan, I'd like you to come by tomorrow. There are some papers you should see." He hesitated, then agreed, perhaps thinking I meant to surrender, to make peace. I didn't correct him. Let him come. The next day I prepared the house as if for a ritual. I cleaned the table where he had once placed the blue folder, the stage of my undoing. I laid out the documents, the reinstatement letter, the final report from the oversight board, and the affidavit bearing my signature beside Marjorie's. The same hand that had once betrayed me now documented my victory. I brewed coffee, not for hospitality, but for ceremony, because it seemed fitting that the moment of truth should smell like something familiar. When the knock came, it was soft, hesitant. I opened the door to find him standing there, the crispness of his suit almost offensive against the fading warmth of the afternoon. He smiled, uncertain, like a man approaching a courtroom he had thought closed. "Mom," he said, his tone careful, polite, as though speaking to a client. "You wanted to see me?" I stepped aside and gestured toward the table. "Yes, come in. I think it's time we finish this properly." He walked in, his eyes flicking over the documents. "You didn't need to go through all that trouble," he began, but I cut him off with a calm that surprised even me. "Sit down, Evan." The authority in my voice left no room for negotiation. He sat. I poured coffee into 2 cups, placed one before him, and said nothing for a long time. The silence stretched until he finally broke it, his voice uneasy. "I read the decision. They sided with you. Congratulations." The way he said it, half resentful, half patronizing, ignited something quiet and fierce in me. "I didn't win, Evan," I said. "I reclaimed what was mine. There's a difference." He looked away, pretending to study the steam rising from his cup. "You make it sound like I stole something," he muttered. "You did," I said softly. "You stole my trust, my autonomy, and my peace. You convinced yourself it was for my own good, but the truth is simpler. You wanted control. You wanted to make me smaller because you couldn't bear the weight of gratitude." He opened his mouth to protest, but I kept speaking, my words steady and deliberate. "Do you know what it feels like to wake up one day and realize your life has been signed away with your own hand? To know that the person who handed you the pen did so with a smile?" He didn't answer, and for the first time, I saw not the confident man who lectured me about efficiency, but a frightened child cornered by his own reflection. I slid the affidavit across the table toward him. "This," I said, "is what you took from me. And this," I laid the reinstatement letter beside it, "is what I took back." He stared at the papers, jaw clenched, his silence filling the room with static. Finally, he spoke. "You've embarrassed me," he said quietly. "You made me look like a predator." I leaned forward, the tremor in my hand betraying none of the steel in my voice. "You did that yourself. I simply turned on the light." He stood abruptly, pushing the chair back. "This isn't fair," he said, his composure fraying. "You don't understand how hard things have been for me, for us. I was just trying to make things manageable." I looked up at him, and for a moment I saw the flicker of the boy he once was, the one who used to run through the sprinklers in summer, who cried when the dog died, who believed love was something simple and endless. But love that excuses cruelty isn't love, it's dependence. "Evan," I said softly, "you built your comfort on my fear. That's not management, that's theft." He sank back into the chair, his shoulders collapsing inward. "What do you want from me?" he asked finally, his voice low, almost defeated. The question hung in the air between us like smoke. What did I want? For months I had imagined this moment, the apology, the confession, the catharsis. But as I looked at him now, I realized I didn't need any of it. "I want you to understand that I am not your liability," I said. "I am not a dependent, a burden, or a problem to solve. You will never use my name for your benefit again. I've closed every joint account, removed you from every authorization, and updated my will. You don't owe me an apology. You owe me absence." His mouth opened slightly, but no words came. The silence between us was absolute, not hostile, but terminal. It was the sound of something ending cleanly, without blood, without spectacle. He stood slowly, looked around the room as if memorizing it, and said, almost inaudibly, "You're cutting me out." I nodded. "Yes, completely." He nodded too, once, a movement small and mechanical. For a second, I thought he might reach for me, but his hand stayed at his side. Without another word, he walked to the door. At the threshold, he paused, his back to me. "You always taught me to be practical," he said. "I guess I learned too well." Then he left. The sound of the door closing was sharp, final. I stood there for a long time, the fading light spilling across the floor, the air still carrying the ghost of his cologne. Then I exhaled. It wasn't triumph I felt. It was release, pure and unadorned. I had not punished him. I had liberated myself. There's a difference, and it matters. Later that night, I gathered all the old papers, the original policy, the forged forms, the letters of denial, and fed them one by one into the fireplace. The paper curled and darkened, the ink dissolving into flame. The room filled with the faint scent of smoke and something like resolution. I sat before the fire, watching the edges of each document crumble to ash, and thought about all the years I'd spent believing that motherhood meant unconditional forgiveness. It doesn't. It means responsibility, to love without losing yourself. I had confused compassion with compliance, and it had almost killed me. When the last paper turned to embers, I stirred them gently with the poker, then watched the ashes drift upward like slow, luminous snow. In that moment, I felt the strange grace of finality. The law had restored my rights, but the fire restored my spirit. I was free, not young, not unscarred, but free. And freedom at 76, after a lifetime of quiet submission, feels almost divine. Before going to bed, I wrote one last note in my notebook, the same one that had begun as a list of fears and ended as a record of endurance. I wrote, I have nothing left that can be taken without my consent. Then, underneath, I added a single line, and that includes forgiveness. I slept deeply that night. No dreams, no shadows, just the quiet certainty that the story had found its end. When morning came, the sun rose over the garden, and for the first time in years, I didn't wonder whether anyone would visit. I made coffee, opened the window, and let the air in, cool, clean, indifferent to all human betrayals. The house felt lighter, almost new. I was no longer a woman waiting for a call, a refill, or a resolution. I was simply Jean Davis again, alive, sufficient, and entirely my own. In the weeks that followed, the silence that settled around me was not the heavy, suffocating kind that had haunted the months of fear and confusion. It was a gentler silence, clean and breathable, the kind that follows a storm when the world seems rinsed of illusion. The days began to stretch differently, not as something to be endured, but as something that belonged to me again. I no longer woke to the dull dread of uncertainty or the ache of dependence. My mornings became rituals of quiet reclamation. I would open the curtains, let the light spill into the kitchen, and make coffee in the small pot Derek and I had bought decades ago at a yard sale. The smell of it was comforting, solid, a reminder that some things, simple, honest things, still remained untouched by deceit. I kept volunteering at the elder law clinic, as Marjorie had asked. She said my case had already become a reference for other women in similar situations, though the thought of that made me both proud and quietly mournful. It meant there were others, many others, who had been made to feel small inside their own lives. At the clinic, I sat with women whose stories sounded like faint echoes of mine, daughters taking control of mothers' finances, sons convincing fathers to sign for convenience, nieces altering wills in the name of efficiency. Each tale was wrapped in the same fabric of affection and betrayal. When they spoke, I listened not as an expert, but as a survivor who knew the weight of a pen and the cost of trust. Sometimes, just seeing me sitting there, a woman who had come through it and still stood upright, seemed to give them something more valuable than advice, permission to fight back. It was in those hours, surrounded by the soft murmur of paperwork and the scent of coffee from the break room, that I began to understand what freedom really felt like. It wasn't grand or dramatic. It was not the loud declaration of independence that young people imagine. It was the simple act of choosing when to speak, when to be still, when to say no without fear of being erased. I had spent so many years mistaking peace for compliance, thinking that silence was a form of grace. But silence, I realized, is only holy when it is chosen, not imposed. Occasionally, I thought of Evan. Weeks passed without a word from him. Then, one afternoon, an envelope arrived with his handwriting on it. I turned it over in my hands for a long time before opening it. Inside was a single page. The first line read, "I don't expect you to forgive me." The letter was short, careful, full of apologies that seemed sincere and yet restrained, as though written by a man afraid of saying too much. He wrote that he had acted out of fear of losing control, fear of watching me age, fear of his own failures. He said he had convinced himself that taking responsibility for me would somehow protect us both. It was not an excuse, and he didn't offer one. He ended the letter with a sentence that lingered in me for days. "You taught me how to build a life, but I didn't realize until now that you also taught me how to destroy one." I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer with Derek's old watch and the note I had written to myself weeks earlier, the one that said, "Read everything. Trust your gut. You're not old. You're aware." I didn't write back to Evan, not because I wanted to punish him, but because some apologies are not meant to be answered. They are meant to remain suspended in the air, like faint prayers, acknowledged but not absolved. I had no anger left, only a kind of distant compassion, the way one might feel toward a child who never learned that love cannot be built from fear. Autumn slid quietly into winter. The garden outside my window turned bare. The earth folded into itself, resting. I found comfort in that rhythm. Survival, after all, is not about constant blooming. It's about knowing when to go still so that something inside can renew. I began writing again, not letters or statements, but reflections, small pieces of memory woven with fragments of thought. I wrote about aging, about invisibility, about the strange loneliness of being both needed and dismissed. I wrote about the danger of confusing loyalty with silence. Sometimes I thought of turning those writings into something larger, maybe a small handbook for women like me. Not a legal guide, but a guide for the spirit, a reminder that even in the twilight years, autonomy is not a luxury, it's a birthright. Every so often, I still visit the pharmacy that once turned me away. The young pharmacist, the same one who had looked so apologetic that day, now greets me with genuine warmth. "Everything in order, Mrs. Davis?" he asks, and I nod, smiling. Everything, I think, finally is. On the walk home, I sometimes pass mothers with strollers, young men talking loudly on their phones, women rushing from errands, and I watch them without bitterness. The world spins on, endlessly occupied with its small urgencies, and I no longer need to chase it. My life moves at its own deliberate pace, and that is its own kind of victory. On Sundays, I visit the small park near the bus stop. There's a wooden bench there, slightly tilted, where Derek and I once used to sit. From that spot, I can see the horizon between the bare trees. I sit with a thermos of coffee and let the cold air sting my cheeks. I think of all the women I've met at the clinic, all the quiet voices that have begun to rise, steady and certain. Sometimes one of them joins me, and we sit in silence, not the fearful kind, but the companionable kind, the kind shared between those who have learned that peace doesn't require approval. I suppose this is what healing looks like at 76. It's not about forgetting or forgiving or even moving on. It's about remembering differently. The pain no longer defines the days. It shapes them into something more deliberate. There's no triumphal music, no grand revelation, just a quiet pulse of clarity that runs through everything I do. I am still Mrs. Davis, still 76, still the woman who once signed her name without reading, but I am also the woman who read her own story aloud and refused to let someone else write the ending. If anyone were to ask me what I've learned, I would tell them this. Love that demands blindness is not love. It is control dressed in kindness. And trust, when given to those who have not earned it, becomes the easiest weapon against you. But even after everything, I haven't stopped believing in love. I've just learned to believe in the kind that doesn't ask for silence in return. Sometimes, when I lock the door at night, I whisper a small prayer, not to any god, but to the woman I used to be. I tell her, we made it. And in that whisper, I hear not regret, but gratitude for every scar, every signature, every moment of disbelief that became proof of endurance. And to any woman who might someday find herself holding a pen, her hand trembling between trust and doubt, I would say this: read everything, twice if you must, and never mistake love for permission. The world will call you old, stubborn, difficult. Let it. Those are just the words people use when they realize you have stopped being easy to deceive.